Yes. So yes, thank you all for coming. It's always an honor to be back in the CEFAS, which is a cradle for me, because I arrived at the CEFAS someday in Yemen in September 2001. Actually, I traveled on September 12th, so it was really a particular time. And Yemen is, as I will try to show you, not any kind of place. I'm sure many of you have visited it. Those who haven't have probably seen pictures of it. And I wanted to sort of brush in a broad way, but I will try to give some meaning to the sort of trajectory of the image of Yemen in different types of production, either artistic, meaning the paintings, poetry, literature at large, but also a number of travelogues which have been published not only by foreigners. So I'm not only going to focus on the orientalistic image of Yemen, but also on what neighboring countries have developed when it comes to Yemen. So like I said, Yemen is not like any country, and when we would mention the country to the larger public, nowadays I'm sure that very negative images of war, destruction would come up. Obviously, and since you're an informed public, you know that this is not necessarily the only thing that matters, and that there's much more to Yemen than these now dominant images. So more than probably other countries in the region, Yemen has generated a number of fantasies, a number of representations that I will try to highlight. What's interesting is that these fantasies are not only Western built, they were also broadcast, generated amongst the Arab public itself. So this short lecture will try to show what are the main characteristics of these images, and also how they have evolved, and how they are now structured around a number of myths, which are very central, I think. So when we're talking of Yemen, there are a number of images for people who know a bit about it. You have a number of landmarks which are very telling, linked to architecture in particular. If one thinks of the old city of Sana'a, for instance, you have the mountains, which are not that common elsewhere in the region, with heights that reach more than 3,000 meters above sea level. And you have also the archaeological past. And one of the very central images which has been developed is linked to the name Arabia Felix, which means happy or happy Arabia, and which rose in the context of the Greek explorations at first, and which was then reused by the Latins, and which generates a number of fantasies. One of them being that Yemen would be separate from the rest of Arabia, meaning Arabia Deserta, places which are much less hospitable than allegedly Arabia Felix. And this image has been has endured in a number of ways. One of them being through a travelogue, although he himself had not actually visited Yemen in the early 18th century, by a Frenchman, Jean de la Roque, who had an important success at the time, being published in French, but also being spread out in other courts in Europe, which actually focused a lot on the image of a very hospitable Yemen, and which added to the image of this hospitality and this specificity, which again separated it from the rest of Arabia, and, which was coined Arabia Deserta. And this addition was with the issue or the production of coffee, and this was a very central element of the image of Yemen at the time, as the cradle of coffee crops, which were at the time very popular in Europe. So just to show you how much this image of Yemen as a green and very hospitable place was very important in representations, I'll quote a small text by Voltaire, so a French philosopher of the 18th century, which wrote at the time in a book which was meant to focus on the different cultures across the world. And he wrote, when he talks about Yemen, we find the most pleasant country on earth. The air is perfumed there, in a continual summer with the odor of aromatic plants, which nature grows without culture. 1,000 streams descend from the mountains and maintain a perpetual freshness, which tempers the ardor of the sun under evergreen shades. And so this image of a very lush country, one where you also have this production of aromats, and in particular frankincense, was something that has been very much at the core of the representation of Yemen in artistic and intellectual productions. Yet this image went in pairs with another I wouldn't say stereotype, but another representation which was linked much more to the past of Yemen, and to the fact that the past of Yemen was actually still very much present. And so you have a number of figures which have been mobilized by artists to actually highlight the fact that even more than a place which is hospitable, Yemen is also a place where humanity, tribalism, Islam, and civilization were born. And this is something which is very central, I think, in a number of representations. Of course, you have the myth of Bilqis, so the Queen of Sheba, which is very important, which you find in a number of narratives, and which was used again and again by different intellectuals, in particular by André Malraux, which is the 20th century intellectual, one of the most important figures in France. He was actually Minister of Culture under President de Gaulle, and he, in the 1930s, traveled to Yemen. But actually never landed there, but he was looking for the archaeological remains of the kingdom of the Queen of Sheba. And there you have a stamp which was published in the early 1970s, or late 1960s, early 1970s, by the Autocratic Kingdom of Yemen, which actually didn't exist, no longer existed at the time, but he was still printing stamps, and and a huge collection of stamps, which is really interesting. You even find nude models paintings of nudes from the French or Italian Renaissance, which were published at the time because it was they wanted to continue to have a kind of existence through the stamps. Well, this is just a side comment. But there, it's interesting to see how also Yemenis themselves were, in a way, and rightly proud of this, the fact that it was also a cradle of civilization, a cradle of Christianity, and also of Islam. And this myth of the Queen of Sheba has been also used again and again through another production which by Pasolini, so the famous Italian intellectual artist who came in Yemen in 1974 to film his Arabian Nights. If you see the film, you would probably be all shocked by the fact that a number of scenes are actually quite erotic, and that was the purpose of the film at the time. I'm not sure that these scenes were actually shot in Yemen, but many others were, especially in Zabid and Sana'a. And another part of the film has been shot in Iran. But this has been a structuring perception that was very much present again in the production of intellectuals and artists coming from the West. And so Yemen, in a way, was through that constructed as a kind of orientalist dream by these artists, a place where culture had been preserved and which had very interesting past. Sorry. Another thing is that these myths were not only present, like I've said, amongst Westerners. So it's very difficult to actually say that it was purely an Orientalist construction, because at the same time you find very early on, either in the late 19th century or early 20th century, a number of representations coming from Arab intellectuals themselves, which actually construct Yemen as a kind of cradle for their own society. Either when it comes to tribal culture, and you know that tribal genealogy is very important in Yemen, but also across the Arabian Peninsula and the Arab world, where you have a number of, including in North Africa, a number of tribes who claim to be originally from Yemen. And this is something which has constructed, in a way, the perception that Yemen would be the cradle of their own society. And this was present, for instance, in a number of in a book called Muluk al-Arab, so the Kings of Arabs, which was written by Rihani, who was an American originally from Lebanon, from the Levant, who depicted the different courts with a special focus on Yemen, so on the Imamate, and it had a very ambivalent perception of these courts, of the way the dynasties were organized and the rulers ruled their own country, focusing on the backwardness of Yemeni society, while at the same time they themselves, the Arab intellectuals, were very much involved in a process of modernization. And there you have this kind of ambivalence, which I will look into a bit more later on. An example of this kind of image, where Yemen is both a cradle but also a backward country, is in this film, Thawrat al-Yemen, which is an Egyptian film, which is a kind of propaganda feature film from 1964, which mentions the war against the royalists, which was shot, at the time of the war post 1962. So when the Imamate regime was toppled by a revolutionary movement, and it gives a very backward image of the way Yemen is organized and ruled. Which is also quite telling of the representations that exist and which are vehicled by these productions. But one of the very telling things is that when you look at the kind of production that exists, either coming from the West or Arabs themselves, you find out that there is a kind of ambivalence. On the one hand, Yemen is considered, like I said, as a kind of cradle, and so it is meant to have played, its culture is meant to have played a very structuring role in the construction of a more global identity, either being religious or either being Arab. And yet, like I said, a lot of production actually focuses on describing Yemen as a kind of place which is remote, which is also hidden. And this is something which I found out was rather puzzling, because there is, like I said, this ambivalence. It is meant to be the cradle, but it is hidden, it is mysterious, and you have a number of things which show that it is a very almost magical place. Probably one of the most telling examples is the travelogue by Ibn al-Mujawwar. So in the 13th century, there is some discussion as whether he was Arab or Persian. A number of colleagues, historians, consider that he was most likely Persian. But he traveled to Yemen, and he writes a number of accounts of his travels there. And all he focuses on is the kind of mystery and the magic of Yemeni society. So trying to sort of push it back, consider that Yemen in a way is out of this world, which is I feel rather telling. And this remoteness has a number of occurrences. I think that it explains quite a lot. Also about the fascination that Yemen has exercised on a number of people, including the most famous. When you talk about Yemen to intellectuals in France, they would probably mention two names, Rimbaud and Paul Nizan. So Arthur Rimbaud was an early, late 19th century French poet. He's probably the most famous modern poet in France. And he, after a very short career, he moved out of poetry production, and he started he wanted to become a merchant, and so he moved to Aden, and he roamed around Aden. No longer actually wrote anything remotely linked to poetry, only a few letters. And you feel that there was this sense of actually moving out of the world from him, and by going to Aden. And then another very important figure with links to Yemen is Paul Nizan. So Paul Nizan in the early 20th century was a communist activist, but also a writer. And he wrote a book called Aden Arabi after he had traveled there, which is almost a very desperate perception of his own condition, but he also sort of links his own condition of someone who's being a little bit depressed to the fact that he's actually staying in a place which is very hot, where nothing really happens and all. So what's sort of weird when you're thinking that these two very significant figures of the intellectual field had a connection with Yemen, and or with Aden more specifically, and that they linked Aden to a kind of remoteness, being far away from the world, is the fact that at this time, so either the late 19th century or early 20th century, Aden was very much an international hub. It was a British colony where you had a number of very significant flows which unfolded. So there again, you have this kind of ambivalence. And this ambivalence, I'm not sure that the author actually chose this title. But when you look at it, Tim McIntosh Smith, who's someone who's lived for I think over 30 years in the old city of Sana'a. So he's a British man who's very much Yemenized in a way, and he's really blended in the social fabric of the old city. up to the point that he is one of the characters of a documentary where you have a young Yemeni who was born, a young British person of Yemeni origin, who shoots a documentary about Tim McIntosh Smith, introducing him to the country of his own origin. And it's called The Englishman and the Sheikh. And the Sheikh is Tim McIntosh Smith, and the Englishman is the young Yemeni the young British man of Yemeni origin. Sorry. And so you have the title there, The Unknown Arabia. And when you look at the number of publications which have focused on Yemen, you find a lot of this vocabulary: the unknown Arabia, the hidden Arabia, this idea of a kind of seclusion, of a kind of remoteness once again. And I put there a character which is you have had over the last few years. Kuwaiti writer Raif sorry. I'm looking for المتوع. نايف المتوع. Sorry, Naif al-Mutawa, who wrote a series of comics called The 99. And so the 99 is the 99 names of God, his attributes. And one of them being the al-Batin, so the occulted. And quite tellingly, his character, who is a Yemeni, so her name is Rula al-Hadrami, so she's from Hadramaut, and you see that one of her powers is to disappear. And so she's a Batina, which is her name. So her characteristic is to actually disappear. And she's the only Yemeni character. And I thought that was rather telling that, in a way, the Yemeni character, amongst the different attributes of God which exist, was disappearance. And this idea of disappearance is also very much central in all the talk surrounding the current war. If you look at the different titles which deal with the Yemeni war currently, you always hear that it's the hidden war, the ignored war. All these themes are very much central. I'm not considering that they're necessarily right or wrong, but I feel that it is something that in a way is very structural of the way Yemen has been constructed in our collective imagination. But again, if you look at this idea of mystery, of remoteness, etc., you find out that it almost leads to a kind of disdain or mockery. Yemen is seen as a kind of marginal country, which is not necessarily worthy of mentioning. And yet, at the same time, like I told you, there is both respect for Yemen because it is meant to be the cradle of either humanity, Arab civilization, or tribes. And yet, when we're talking about Yemen, there is this kind of a feeling that it is a place which is very very remote. When you look at it, you can consider, in particular, that I've mentioned a lot of French intellectuals, because it is true that you do have a number of French artists and intellectuals who have built a special bond with Yemen. I mentioned Arthur Rimbaud, Paul Nizan, André Malraux, but you could also add René Clément, you could add Auguste Bartholdi, who is the person who designed the Statue of Liberty and who traveled to Yemen in the late 19th century, and he is amongst the first people to have actually photographed the Yemen, in particular Hodeida. And so you have this French presence, also Italian in a way, but very oddly you almost have no British accounts. There is almost no British production which actually focuses on Yemen. And I think this is very telling of the way that the British actually developed their own relationship to the country. There was a presence of over 100 years in Yemen, in Aden, there was a lot of investment in actually building the city, but there was almost no interest in the hinterland. And so the back outside of the Aden port, there was almost nothing. And even if you look at the actual contemporary production, well, you have a number of families who have lived in Yemen, a lot of people, even contemporary people, who have who were born in Yemen, raised there in Aden. But there is almost no trace of these experiences if you look at travelogues, if you look at novels, etc. And this is kind of odd when you, like I've said, compare it to the French production. I may also add, when it comes to France, the journalist, novelist Joseph Kessel, who's very famous in France, who wrote a novel exclusively in Yemen called Fortune Carrée. And so there you have this kind of puzzling dimension, which shows that although the British were very much interested in the commercial dimension, the commercial importance of Aden, they neglected its culture, and it did not raise any kind of production. We could probably say the same when it comes to Arab production. And that is rather interesting. And I tend to explain it, like I've said earlier, by the fact that most Arab intellectuals and artists were more concerned with their future, with developing a kind of, or with engaging with modernity rather than with their own roots. And this explains why when you look at the kind of either songs or novels, there is a kind of unease or a kind of disdain. I remember hearing a saying in 2000 in Baghdad. When I was mentioning Yemen, there was someone who mentioned me saying "Ma'afa alayhu al-zaman falyadhhab ila Yemen." So who suffers from a kind of backwardness, he should go to Yemen. And there's another quote which is mentioned by Tim McIntosh Smith, so the previous book, there, which he recalls that a Syrian engineer who had been at the service of the Imam in the 1930s wrote in his account, "He who enters Yemen is lost, and who leaves it relives." And so there is this kind of sense that Yemen is this kind of backwater that is not very interesting. Of course, you do have a number of exceptions. When I said that it was rather considered as marginal in the intellectual production, we could mention this fellow here, who is a famous Syrian singer, who has a song Banat al-Mukalla, so the girls of Mukalla, which is very famous, which is quite ironic when you think about it, considering that Mukalla in 2015 and 2016 was largely under the control of Al-Qaeda-linked groups. And when you hear that at the time, so in the 1960s, people could dream about the girls of Mukalla and the fact that they could heal any kind of illness, I think is quite interesting, or at least ironic. Other exceptions are linked to the specific trajectory of Yemen, or South Yemen, in the 1960s and 70s with the socialist regime. And there you do have a number of intellectuals who were in a way fascinated by this trajectory. But then it is very specific, because it was not linked to the specific history of Yemen and the images that I mentioned, but much more to political developments. The fact that at the time, South Yemen was the only socialist country in the Arab world. And so Mahmoud Darwish wrote a poem called Dhahabna ila Aden. So we went to Aden, which is a kind of critical of what happened to this kind of experiment. And another exception would be Syrian poet Adonis, who has two collections of poems which deal with Yemen, but which deal with more, I would say, traditional emblems of Yemen. One is called El Mahd, so the cradle, which is also very interesting in telling when I mentioned the fact that Yemen was seen and constructed as this kind of a cradle of humanity. And another one is called Al-Mada'a, so it's the pipe which is the hubbly bubbly, which is smoked by Yemenis there. And when you look at the effects of these representations and this kind of marginal dimension, it has been that Yemeni production itself has been rather marginalized. One of the examples you can get is from this figure here, Abdallah al-Baradoni, who is a very important figure in Yemen. We even have coins with his face on it. He wrote encyclopedias on Yemeni history and Yemeni traditions. He also had collections of poems which are tremendously well known in Yemen. And yet, if you would ask Kuwaitis, Saudis, Egyptians, name one Yemeni intellectual or one Yemeni writer, they would probably be unable to name anyone. This can be seen when the Arab Union of Writers issued in the 2000s what they saw as the top 100 or 100 most important novels written by Arab writers. And you only see two occurrences by Yemeni writers. One is Rahina, so the hostage, which is ranked 45th, which is written by Zayd Mutiat Damaj. And the other one is Sana'a Madina Maftuha, which is ranked 58th by Muhammad Abdel Wali. And so this actually shows that there is kind of a form of disdain and ignorance, and also a kind of mockery, which is probably shown in a very almost shocking way in an episode which was shot in 1994 of the very famous Friends, which the plot of the episode is that one of the characters has a girl who has fallen in love with him, and it's not reciprocal, and so he's trying to find a way to get rid of the young woman, and the way he gets rid of it is, I'm only going to pretend I'm moving to Yemen. It's the only way I can get rid of her, okay? And so all the time, all through the episode, whenever Yemen is mentioned, you always have these kinds of laughs, which actually show that Yemen is, in the imaginary of the writers and of the general public, probably one of the most remote places, and a place where you can actually mock. And so the other, his friend, says, "Oh, good one." And Yemen, that actually sounds like a real country. And so this idea, it can be funny, and at the end, he's actually forced to actually embark on a plane that goes to Yemen, because he's pushing the joke a bit too far. He's having the girl accompany him to the airport, and he ends up embarking on the plane. So this idea of a marginal and disdained country has further evolved up to a point that Yemen was transformed and became a source of danger through the political developments in the region in the 1990s and early 2000s. The image of Yemen shifted directly. Of course, it shifted first and foremost in the view of journalists, in the view of politicians, decision makers, But you also had a number of occurrences in the intellectual production. At the time when Yemen was in a way subject to pressure in the framework of the war on terror, you did have a resistance coming from a number of intellectuals, a number of artists who focused on the very marvelous past of Yemen, but still you had this production. So I put just one book, which is much earlier. But I think it's rather funny, especially with the title and the image, which is a pulp fiction. So it's not a very serious book, but still quite funny. But just going back to the idea of a threatening country, you had the issue of kidnappings, which gave way to a number of productions which focus on this issue. A number of comics, for instance, relate issues of kidnappings, which are carried out by tribes, and which at times mix with more political grievances or ones related to jihadi groups. But you also have the Hollywood production, which has been very much criticized for giving very very bad representations of Arabs in general, but you do have productions which focus specifically on Yemen. One of them being a film called The Rules of Engagement with Tommy Lee Jones and Samuel L. Jackson, so not unknown actors, which is a story about basically a terrorist group in Yemen and soldiers who are in the embassy, American soldiers who are in the American embassy and who shoot at a demonstration, and so they are at first accused of having used force in an unjust or unworthy manner, but they actually managed to show that the demonstrations were actually demonstrations organized by a terrorist group. So this again, this brings in a new kind of image, and it's very. It wasn't shot in Yemen, but it's very directly considered to be in Yemen, and the country is named as such. And there you have this picture, which is much more recent, but which is Prison Break. The season 5 was meant to be happening in Yemen. It was shot in Morocco, but was meant to portray the situation in Yemen. And there is a lot that deals with the Islamic State, so and so, with again a number of myths. Which were central, and one of them was linked to the figure of Osama bin Laden, who originally had his family roots in Yemen, but this was the kind of thing that came on and on. It was not necessarily central in the intellectual production, but still you would find it in a number of either op-eds or other types of reports. And what I think is really telling is that you find out that in building these images, either the very positive ones or the more negative ones, most of the time Yemenis were in a way excluded themselves, and they were not the main actors. When you look at the way that, for instance, they would value their own past, most of the time it would also be a past that was valued at the same time by the West. And what has happened is that you can see that there has been a more recent shift with Yemenis in a way taking more control over their own production, over their own image, through a number of examples. Of course, these examples would be considered to be rather marginal, and I'm not sure that many people actually know them, but there is a kind of trend now that started, I think, with the 2011 uprising, and which sort of manifested itself, or managed to find a number of facilities through the internet and through social media. And a figure which has been studied by someone who I think gave a lecture a few months ago, Anari Elviso, who came to Kuwait and who has been focusing on Arab artists and their circulation. And she has studied the trajectory of this young man, Murad Zubair, who has emerged as a very important artist who does mostly street art with a very political dimension. And when I'm saying that he emerged as very important, it's because if you would type Yemen or Yemen war, you will very often see on Google this image, which has been used again and again, I think because it is a picture that is free of rights, but I mean, if you look at the number of occurrences where you would see his own production, his own street art production being used to illustrate an article which talks about Yemen, you feel that it is an important step. Murad Zubair started off becoming an important artist, an important street artist in 2011. So with the revolutionary uprising of the so-called Yemeni Spring, and he established a number of campaigns which had a very political dimension. So one of them was with enforced disappearances, which managed to actually gain significant information, if not people themselves, who had disappeared earlier on, including in the 1980s. You see there since in 1986. And then he had another campaign which focused on the main social and political issues of Yemen. So you had corruption, you had the drones, you had, and then you had the issue of a war, which is portrayed here. See, this is a missile here with a rose coming out of it. It's very much inspired by Banksy, of course, but he has managed to actually mobilize quite a lot, and that's why I'm saying that through his production, I think that he does play an important role in the Yemeni amongst the Yemeni public, because while he focuses on political matters, I think that in a way he still is quite consensual amongst Yemenis. I mean, I don't think that Yemenis would be in favor of having civilians being targeted. I don't think that many people actually acknowledge that drones are a positive outcome, or that corruption is something that should be encouraged. And yet at the same time, he, like I said, managed to broadcast his own message beyond the borders of Yemen, and this is something that is quite new. And then you have other examples. One of them is this documentary. So Karama has no walls, Laysa Karama Jidran, who was nominated in 2016 for the Oscar. So the best documentary. At the Oscars, he did not win, but the documentary was in a way the first time that a Yemeni film or a Yemeni production managed to actually become known elsewhere than in Yemen. And then you have another initiative which is also interesting, which is called Majalat Sana'a, which is both cultural and political e-magazine, which started around 2 or 3 years ago. It's not as active as it once was, but still it was an initiative which actually tried to show that the voices of Yemenis needed to be heard. And there, this gentleman, I'm sure that if I mention his name, not many people may be familiar with him. But if I mention his Facebook page, probably a number of you have subscribed to it. The Science Nature page. It has over 30 million people who are following it, so it's a very, very significant page. Who was launched by Hashem El-Ghaili. So he's no longer really a student, but he launched this page and directs very short films which deal with contemporary research in science, and they're very well done. He's now based mainly in Germany, but when you know about his initial background, you can consider that this is quite an achievement to understand that coming from a peasant family, although he's a Sayyid, but from a peasant family from Al-Mahabsha, so in the surroundings of Hajjaj Governorate, and having managed to become such a very important figure. He has signed contracts with very important firms in the US to actually broadcast his work. So I mean, these show that there is a kind of a new development, which is that in a way, almost for the first time, Yemenis are able to actually have their voice broadcast and eventually heard. It's not necessarily being, it still is in a way marginalized, but there are a number of channels which are being developed, and I think this is something that we should take into account, especially as researchers, because we often tend to consider that the voices of the people who we are in a way studying are not that important, and it is I think we should make every effort to actually take them into account in a much more important way. There have been initiatives. This is my most recent book, but you also have this one which was directed by Franck Mernier. So Franck Mernier is an anthropologist and who happens to have been a director of the CEFAS a few years ago, or I should say almost decades. And this book was also published with support from the CEFAS. And it's quite I think a very important project, because it aims to translate the intellectual production of Yemenis on the current war, and make this production accessible to the wider public in France. You have had quite similar projects in English, but I don't think they were as constructed as this purpose of actually letting the voices of Yemenis be heard beyond the Arab-speaking world. I think that this effort is not only in a way a project for Western academics, Western journalists also, but also I think within the Arab world also there is probably a kind of responsibility and also an effort that should be carried out. When I'm saying that Westerners have this kind of bias, often when I'm either questioned or I hear journalists saying, "Oh, but one of the problems we don't really talk about Yemen because there are no journalists in Yemen." I'm like, what? There are no foreign journalists, maybe there are no Western journalists for sure, but you do have journalists in Yemen, and I think that we need to make the effort to actually acknowledge this and consider that it's not because they are Yemenis or Arabs in general that their voice is unworthy. I think much to the contrary. Of course, there might be biases, and there are a number of political biases. I wrote a review of this book, and I consider that although the project is very important and it is a beautiful project, it does introduce a number of biases, which are political ones, but still, I mean, the importance of having these voices heard is very important, and they must be heard and also respected. Thank you.